Do you truly believe in God, or have you simply never questioned why you believe? For more than 2,000 years, some of the greatest philosophers in history have faced this question head-on. Plato, St. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Camus, and many others engaged in an intellectual battle that continues to this day. Their ideas challenged faith, reason, and everything we think we know about existence. In this video, you'll discover the most devastating philosophical conflicts about God debates that divided great thinkers, shaped civilizations, and still leave us with one powerful question. In the end, is it possible to find a definitive answer? Plato was one of the first philosophers to deeply explore what lies beyond the reality our senses can perceive. When we think about God, we often imagine an all-powerful being who created the universe out of nothing. But Plato offers a very different perspective. In the Republic and Timaeus, he invites us to look past appearances and ask, what if true reality exists beyond the visible world? What if everything we see every day is only a shadow of something far more perfect? This idea begins with a basic distinction between two worlds. The first is the physical world, the one we live in, where everything is constantly changing. It is a world of birth, death, imperfection, and transformation. Everything here grows old, wears out, and eventually disappears. The second is the intelligible world, where the perfect, eternal, and unchanging forms or ideas exist. According to Plato, whenever we recognize something as beautiful, just, or good, we are only seeing an imperfect reflection of these eternal forms. In other words, perfection does not belong to the material world. It exists in a higher reality. It is within this framework that Plato introduces one of the most important ideas in his philosophy, the form of the good. In the Republic, he describes the good as the highest principle of reality. Just as the sun gives light to the world and allows our eyes to see, the good gives light to the human mind and makes it possible to know the truth. The good is not simply a moral virtue, it is the source of all intelligible existence. Without it, nothing could be fully understood. This comparison shows that Plato is describing something very close to what many religious traditions would call the divine. However, Plato does not describe this highest principle as a personal God who directly intervenes in human life. Instead, in Timaeus, he introduces the figure of the demiurge. The word literally means craftsman or builder. Unlike the creator found in many monotheistic religions, the demiurge does not create matter out of nothing. Matter already exists, but it is in a state of disorder. The demiurge's role is to look to the perfect world of forms and organize the material universe according to that eternal model. This difference completely changes the way we think about the origin of the universe. Instead of imagining God creating everything through a single act of creation, Plato describes a rational organizer who brings order out of chaos. The universe becomes the work of intelligence, built according to mathematical principles, harmony, and proportion. For Plato, the beauty of the cosmos is not the result of chance, but of a higher reason striving to reflect, as much as possible, the perfection of the intelligible world. But this idea raises a question that philosophers still debate today. If the demiurge is perfectly good and follows perfect models, why is the world still filled with limitations, suffering, and imperfection? Plato's answer is not that the organizer is flawed, but that matter itself has limitations. Matter resists perfection. It can never fully reflect the eternal forms. In other words, the problem does not lie with the intelligence that orders the universe, but with the nature of the material world itself. This explanation reveals one of the defining features of Plato's philosophy. Evil does not exist as an independent force. Instead, it arises from the gap between the perfection of the forms and the imperfection of matter. This idea would deeply influence centuries of philosophical and religious thought, especially thinkers like St. Augustine, who later developed the idea that evil is the absence of good. Although Augustine followed a different theological path, Plato's influence on his thinking is impossible to ignore. Another fascinating aspect of Plato's philosophy is the connection between knowledge and drawing closer to the divine. For Plato, learning is not just about collecting information. It is a process of raising the soul. The more a person seeks truth, justice, and goodness, the closer they come to a higher reality. Philosophy is no longer just an intellectual exercise. It becomes a path of inner transformation. The true philosopher is not trying to win arguments, but to free themselves from illusion and contemplate what is eternal. This idea is beautifully illustrated in Plato's famous allegory of the cave, found in the Republic. Although the story never directly mentions God, presents a powerful image of humanity's journey toward truth. The prisoners mistake shadows for reality because they have never known anything else. When one of them finally escapes the cave, the light hurts his eyes at first. But little by little, he realizes that the outside world is far more real than the shadows he once believed were true. In this allegory, the sun represents the form of the good, the principle that illuminates all understanding. This metaphor remains just as relevant today. How often is our view of reality shaped only by appearances, popular opinion, or the distractions of everyday life? Plato challenges us to ask whether what we believe we know is actually true, or whether we are still trapped in the shadows of a deeper reality. This question reaches far beyond ancient philosophy and continues to speak to anyone searching for meaning in life. When reflecting on God, Plato also shifts the focus from belief to rational contemplation. Instead of asking us to accept a doctrine without question, he encourages a lifelong search for truth. For him, reason is the tool that guides the soul toward the good. This does not mean every mystery can be solved, but it does mean that there is an intelligible order waiting to be discovered by those willing to look beyond appearances. That is exactly why Plato's philosophy continues to fascinate people more than 2,000 years later. It does not offer easy answers or remove every doubt. Instead, it invites each of us to face a question that remains open to this day. When we see beauty, justice, truth, and harmony in the universe, are we simply observing natural phenomena, or are we catching glimpses of a much greater reality? Perhaps that is Plato's greatest question. Before asking whether God exists, he challenges us to ask whether we are truly capable of seeing beyond the visible world. Since ancient times, one question has stayed with humanity. If everything in the universe seems to follow a certain order, where did that order come from? Just by observing nature for a few moments, it's clear that very little happens by chance. The planets move in predictable paths. The seasons return on schedule. A seed grows into a tree, and life seems to follow principles that go far beyond coincidence. It was this harmony that led Aristotle to develop one of the most influential ideas in the history of philosophy, the existence of the prime mover, a reality that gives purpose to the motion of the universe without ever being moved by anything else. In metaphysics, Aristotle begins with a simple but powerful observation. Everything that moves is moved by something else. A rock only changes position because something pushes it. A plant grows because it has the conditions needed to develop. Fire burns because it has fuel to feed the flame. If we keep following this chain of causes forever, we run into a logical problem. If every movement depends on a previous one, where did all begin? Aristotle argues that this chain cannot go back endlessly without a starting point. There must be a first cause eternal and necessary that explains everything else. This is where the idea of the unmoved prime mover comes in. Unlike the God many people picture today, Aristotle does not describe a being who created the universe at a specific moment in time. For him, the universe has always existed. The prime mover does not create the cosmos or directly interfere with what happens in it. Its role is much deeper. It is the reason why everything in reality remains in motion and strives to fulfill its own potential. This distinction is essential for understanding Aristotle's philosophy. The prime mover does not move the universe like someone pushing a giant machine. Instead, it draws everything toward itself because it represents absolute perfection. Aristotle believed that everything naturally seeks to become the best version of itself. A child grows into an adult. An artist works to improve their craft. A student strives to gain knowledge. Throughout nature, there is a constant drive toward growth and fulfillment. The prime mover represents the highest state of perfection that guides all of existence. To explain this idea, Aristotle developed what is known as the theory of the four causes. One of them is the final cause, perhaps the most important in his philosophy. The final cause answers the question, what is something for? A boat exists to sail. A musical instrument exists to produce music. In the same way, all of reality moves toward a greater purpose. A prime mover is that ultimate goal, not because it forces things to move, but because everything finds its highest fulfillment in it. This way of understanding God is very different from the one found in many religious traditions. Instead of a being who watches over people's daily lives, listens to prayers, or steps into specific events, Aristotle presents a reality that is completely perfect and complete. And because it is perfect, it has no need to change, react, or make new decisions. After all, any change would mean moving from a less perfect state to a more perfect one. But something that is already absolutely perfect has no need to change at all. This leads Aristotle to a conclusion that still sparks debate today. The prime mover does not focus its attention on the lives of human beings. In metaphysics, Aristotle says that the highest activity of this reality is the eternal contemplation of itself. This is where one of the most famous expressions in his philosophy comes from: thought thinking itself. God contemplates only perfection because nothing is more worthy of his attention than his own perfect nature. For many people, this idea feels surprising. We are used to thinking of God as someone who knows our fears, comforts us in our pain, and takes part in human history. Aristotle's prime mover seems silent in the face of life's joys and tragedies. Does that mean it is indifferent to human suffering? From Aristotle's point of view, the answer is yes. But this indifference is not the result of cruelty or a lack of compassion. It is a consequence of absolute perfection. The prime mover remains eternal, unchanging, and completely fulfilled. This view dramatically changes the way we think about our own responsibility. If God does not directly shape our lives, then it is up to us to develop the best qualities within ourselves. This is exactly the idea Aristotle explores in the Nicomachean Ethics. Instead of teaching people how to earn God's favor, he asks a much more practical question. How can a human being live a good life? His answer is found in what he calls virtue. According to Aristotle, no one is born fully virtuous. Character is shaped by the choices we make over time. Courage develops when we face our fears with balance and wisdom. Generosity grows when we learn to give without becoming either selfish or excessive. Justice is built when we treat others fairly, even when it would be easier not to. In other words, moral excellence is not the result of a miracle, but of consistent practice. This idea is just as relevant today as it was over 2,000 years ago. In a world where many people expect instant solutions to their problems, Aristotle reminds us that real change happens slowly. It is not enough to want to become a better person. We have to build that life through our daily actions. Our happiness depends not only on external circumstances, but above all, on the qualities we choose to develop within ourselves. Another fascinating part of Aristotle's philosophy is the importance he places on reason. He believed that what sets human beings apart from every other living creature is our ability to think, reflect, and understand the world. For this reason, the highest purpose of human life is not the endless pursuit of wealth, fame, or pleasure, but the pursuit of truth. The more we develop our minds and deepen our understanding of reality, the more fully we become what we were meant to be. This view turns philosophy into much more than an intellectual exercise. It becomes a way of life. Every decision, every habit, and every choice either brings us closer to or farther away from our highest potential. The universe follows a rational order, but it is up to each person to find their place within that order through wisdom, self-discipline, and virtue. More than 2,000 years later, Aristotle's ideas still challenge the way we think about God. Perhaps the most important question is not simply whether there is a supreme principle governing the universe. The more unsettling question is this: if that principle does not directly shape our destiny, then how much responsibility do we have for the lives we create? Aristotle shifts the focus away from expecting divine intervention and toward personal responsibility, reminding us that the pursuit of excellence depends, above all, on the choices we make every single day. Few questions have remained as powerful throughout history as this one. If God is perfectly good, why is there so much suffering in the world? Just looking at reality makes it clear that this is not only a philosophical question, it comes from human experience. Wars, diseases, injustice, unexpected loss, and personal tragedies all seem to challenge the idea of a loving and just God. If he has the power to stop evil, but doesn't, is he really good? If he wants to stop it, but can't, is he really all-powerful? Faced with this dilemma, St. Augustine devoted much of his life to finding an answer that could bring together reason, faith, and human experience. Before becoming one of the greatest thinkers in Christian history, Augustine went through a long period of intellectual searching. In Confessions, he honestly tells the story of his search for truth. For many years, he believed the universe was ruled by two equally powerful and opposing forces, good and evil. This belief, known as Manichaeism, seemed to offer a simple explanation for the conflicts of life. If there is so much suffering in the world, perhaps there is an evil force fighting against God. But over time, this answer no longer satisfied him. The more he reflected, the more he realized that accepting two absolute powers would limit the very idea of a supreme God. That is when Augustine developed one of the most influential ideas in the history of philosophy and theology. Evil is not a substance or an independent force. It does not exist on its own. Instead, evil is the absence of good, just as darkness is the absence of light. When you turn off a lamp, darkness does not enter the room as a separate thing. It simply appears because the light is gone. In the same way, Augustine believed that God created everything good. Evil appears when that goodness becomes corrupted, weakened, or turned away from its true purpose. This idea completely changes the way we look at the problem. Instead of asking who created evil, Augustine invites us to ask how something that was originally good can become imperfect. His answer centers on one of God's greatest gifts to humanity, free will. According to Augustine, God did not create people to obey him like machines. He created human beings with the ability to choose. And every real choice includes the possibility of making the wrong one. This freedom is essential for love to be genuine. Imagine someone being forced to love another person because they had no other option. Would that really be love? Augustine's answer is no. Love only has value when it is freely chosen. That is why God allows human beings to choose, even if that choice means turning away from him. The risk of freedom is that people can use this gift to create injustice, selfishness, and violence. In Confessions, Augustine does not present these ideas as an abstract theory. He talks about his own life. He reflects on his mistakes, his uncontrolled desires, and his poor decisions, admitting that many times he knew what was right, but chose a different path. One of the most famous stories in the book is his memory of stealing pears as a teenager. The pears themselves had little value. What stayed with him was the realization that he did not steal because he needed them. He stole simply because he enjoyed doing something he knew was wrong. This seemingly small event became a powerful symbol of humanity's ability to act against its own conscience. This leads Augustine to an important conclusion. Much of the suffering in the world does not exist because God wants people to suffer, but because human beings misuse the freedom they have been given. Wars do not begin on their own. Corruption does not appear out of nowhere. Injustice does not fall from the sky. These things are the result of real choices made by individuals and societies. This does not mean that every kind of suffering is the direct result of someone's personal decision, but it does show that much of the moral evil in the world comes from the way we use our freedom. Still, Augustine also wrestles with an even harder question. What about suffering that seems completely unrelated to human choices? Illness, natural disasters, or the death of innocent people remain deeply painful realities. In The City of God, written after the sack of Rome, Augustine addresses this challenge by arguing that human history cannot be understood only through visible events. He distinguishes between the city of man, driven by temporary interests, and the city of God, guided by eternal values. We often judge events based only on their immediate impact, while God sees the entire story. This perspective does not remove pain, but it offers a different way of understanding it. Augustine believed that suffering can reveal truths about life that are difficult to see during times of comfort. He does not glorify pain or claim that suffering is good in itself. On the contrary, he recognizes how heavy it can be. But he also believes that even the hardest experiences can become opportunities for inner growth when they are guided by love for God. Another key part of Augustine's philosophy is his understanding of the human heart. At the very beginning of Confessions, he writes one of the most famous lines in Christian history: "You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." This sentence captures the heart of his thinking. Human beings search for happiness in wealth, power, pleasure, recognition, and countless other achievements, yet none of these things can completely satisfy our deepest longing. There is a restlessness within us that points to something greater than anything the material world can offer. According to Augustine, this restlessness explains why so many of our choices end in disappointment. When we try to fill a spiritual emptiness with temporary things, frustration is unavoidable. The problem is not that the good things in life are bad. The problem is making them the ultimate purpose of our existence. For Augustine, evil begins when things that should have a secondary place become the center of the human heart. His reflections remain remarkably relevant today. In a society driven by the endless pursuit of success, consumerism, and instant gratification, many people still experience a feeling that is hard to explain. They have more comfort than previous generations, yet they remain deeply restless. Augustine would argue that this restlessness is not a flaw in human nature. It is a sign that we were created for something that no earthly achievement can replace. In the end, Augustine does not offer an answer that removes every mystery surrounding suffering. Instead, he invites us to look at the question differently. Perhaps the most important question is not simply, why does evil exist? But rather, what do we do with the freedom we have been given in a world where evil exists? This shift places responsibility back on each of us and reminds us that our choices, both small and great, help shape a world that becomes either more just or more cruel. It is in this meeting point between freedom, responsibility, and the pursuit of goodness that St. Augustine offers his deepest answer to one of philosophy's greatest questions. Throughout history, many people have said they believe in God because they were raised in a religious family, had spiritual experiences, or found comfort in their faith. But one question has been debated for centuries. Can God's existence be demonstrated through reason alone, without relying on Scripture or faith? This question was at the center of the work of one of the greatest thinkers of the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas. At a time when philosophy and theology were closely connected, he took on an extraordinary challenge: to show that human reason, when used carefully and logically, could also lead to the conclusion that God exists. Thomas Aquinas saw no conflict between reason and faith. In fact, he believed they were two different paths leading to the same truth. Reason explores what can be discovered through observation and logic. Faith reveals truths that go beyond the natural limits of human understanding. In his works, Summa Theologica and Summa Contra Gentiles, Aquinas insists that these two ways of knowing are not enemies. If truth is one, then there can be no contradiction between what God reveals and what reason correctly discovers. This idea was revolutionary for its time. Instead of asking people to accept God's existence based only on religious authority, Thomas proposed a philosophical investigation. His starting point was not a sacred text, but the world itself. He believed that nature contains signs capable of leading the human mind to a higher cause, not because reason can fully understand God, but because it can recognize that reality points beyond itself. This is how his famous 5 ways came to be, presented in the Summa Theologica. It is important to understand that these are not mathematical proofs designed to remove every possible doubt. They are philosophical arguments that suggest certain features of the universe make more sense if we accept the existence of a necessary, eternal, and absolute being. The first way begins with motion. Everything we observe is constantly changing. Objects move, plants grow, stars follow their paths, and even our thoughts change over time. According to Thomas Aquinas, whatever is in motion must be moved by something else. If every cause depended forever on another cause before it, we would never reach a complete explanation for motion itself. Therefore, he concludes that there must be a first mover that starts the chain without needing to be moved by anything else. Aquinas identifies this first mover as God. The second way follows a similar line of reasoning, but focuses on cause and effect. Nothing appears to be the cause of itself. Everything that exists depends on something that came before it. A house depends on a builder. A tree depends on a seed. Life itself depends on countless conditions that make it possible. If every cause were simply the result of another endless chain of causes, there would never be an ultimate foundation for anything that exists. Aquinas concludes that there must be a first cause that was not caused by anything else. The third way is perhaps one of the deepest. It begins with the observation that everything we know could, at some point, stop existing. People die, civilizations disappear, stars burn out, and even galaxies have life cycles. These things are what philosophers call contingent. They exist, but they do not have to exist. If everything were contingent, then there could have been a time when absolutely nothing existed. And if nothing existed, nothing could ever come into existence. Therefore, Thomas argues that there must be a necessary being whose existence depends on nothing else. This necessary being is what sustains all existence. The last 2 ways take a different approach. The fourth way looks at the different degrees of perfection we recognize in the world. We say that one person is wiser, kinder, or more just than another. But in order to compare different levels of something, there must be a highest standard by which those comparisons are made. Just as we recognize different levels of heat because we understand the concept of temperature, Thomas argues that the existence of varying degrees of perfection points to an absolute perfection, fully found only in God. The fifth way focuses on the order found in nature. Even things without intelligence seem to act in consistent ways to achieve specific purposes. Seeds grow into the same kind of trees. Natural cycles follow remarkable patterns. The universe itself seems to operate according to stable laws. For Thomas Aquinas, this order is not simply the result of pure chance. Instead, it points to the work of an intelligent designer who directs all things toward their natural goals. These arguments are not meant to answer every question about God. In fact, Thomas openly admits that proving the existence of a first principle is not the same as fully understanding God's nature. Reason can lead us to recognize that God exists, but it cannot fully grasp his infinite essence. It is like someone standing far away from a mountain. They know the mountain is there and can appreciate its greatness, but they are still far from seeing every detail. This intellectual humility is one of the most fascinating parts of Aquinas' philosophy. Although he had great confidence in the power of reason, he never treated it as unlimited. There comes a point where human understanding reaches its limits. Beyond that point, philosophy remains valuable, but it can no longer answer every question about the divine on its own. At the same time, Thomas rejected the idea of a faith based only on emotions or unsupported beliefs. For him, believing did not mean giving up critical thinking. On the contrary, he believed that reason is a gift that should be used in the search for truth. The more deeply we explore reality, the more we discover questions that go beyond what our senses alone can explain. His influence has lasted for centuries. Even philosophers who disagreed with his conclusions recognized the logical strength of his arguments. The 5 ways are still studied in universities, seminaries, and philosophy departments because they remain one of the most sophisticated attempts to build a bridge between observation, logic, and the idea of transcendence. Thomas Aquinas also leaves us with an important lesson about the pursuit of knowledge. Searching for truth requires patience, careful thinking, and the willingness to admit when our certainty falls short. In a world where quick opinions often replace deep reflection, his method reminds us that understanding life's biggest questions takes far more than simple answers. It requires investigation, intellectual honesty, and the courage to follow reason as far as it can lead. In the end, the question Thomas Aquinas asked is still alive today because it touches one of the greatest challenges of being human. When we look at the order of the universe, the existence of life, and our own ability to think about these things, are we simply observing natural phenomena, or are we seeing signs of a higher reality? His philosophy does not force anyone to believe. Instead, it invites each of us to consider whether reason itself, when used honestly and deeply, might lead us to questions far greater than we imagined when we first began the journey. Some of the most important decisions in life can't be made with absolute proof. We choose a career without knowing exactly what the future holds. We trust people without any guarantee they will never let us down. We make plans, take risks, and move forward based on probability, not certainty. Blaise Pascal realized that the question of God belongs in the same category. If no one can definitively prove whether God exists or does not exist, how should we respond to that uncertainty? In his book Pensées, Thoughts, he offers one of the most famous and debated ideas in philosophy. Perhaps believing in God is, above all, a bet. Pascal was not only a philosopher. He was also a mathematician, a physicist, and one of the pioneers of probability theory. His mind was trained to think about risks and consequences. So when he turned his attention to religion, he did not begin by asking, "Does God exist?" Instead, he asked a much more practical question. What should a rational person do when they cannot know the answer for certain? According to Pascal, remaining neutral is not an option. Even choosing not to choose is still a choice. Life forces every person to place a bet, whether they want to or not. This completely changes the focus of the discussion. Instead of trying to settle an impossible metaphysical debate with arguments alone, Pascal looks at the consequences of each position. If someone believes in God, and God truly exists, the reward is infinite, eternal life with the Creator. If they believe and God does not exist, the loss is limited to the sacrifices and religious practices they followed during life. Now consider the opposite situation. If someone rejects God and later discovers that he does exist, the loss could be infinitely greater. From this point of view, betting on God's existence seems to be the most reasonable choice. At first glance, the argument seems simple, almost mathematical. After all, Pascal uses reasoning similar to risk analysis. If there is a chance of an infinite reward at the cost of only a limited sacrifice, the rational decision appears obvious. This idea became known as Pascal's wager, and it has remained one of the most discussed arguments in philosophy because it brings together religion, philosophy, and probability theory in a completely new way. However, reducing Pascal's thought to nothing more than a calculation would be a serious mistake. He himself knew that faith does not grow from a simple list of pros and cons. A person does not suddenly begin to believe just because they decide it would be more convenient. Pascal openly acknowledges this problem in thoughts. If someone says, "I want to believe, but I can't," his response is not condemnation, but an invitation to begin a journey. According to Pascal, the human heart often reaches conclusions before reason does. One of his most famous statements captures this idea. The heart has its reasons which reason knows nothing of. This does not mean rejecting logic or rational thinking. Instead, it recognizes that some parts of the human experience, such as love, trust, beauty, and even faith, cannot be fully explained by logic alone. Reason is incredibly valuable, but it does not explain everything about what it means to be human. This understanding comes from Pascal's view of the human condition. He believed that human beings live with a deep contradiction. We are capable of discovering the laws of nature, advancing science, and creating extraordinary works of art, yet we are also incredibly fragile. A single illness, accident, or unexpected loss is enough to remind us how vulnerable we really are. Pascal described this with one of his most memorable images. Human beings are thinking reeds. Physically, we are as fragile as a reed bending in the wind. But what makes us unique is our ability to think about our own existence. It is this awareness that creates restlessness. Unlike other living creatures, we know that one day we will die. We ask questions about the meaning of life, search for lasting happiness, and try to understand what lies beyond our existence. According to Pascal, this inner emptiness is not a flaw in human nature. It points towards something greater. He believed that we carry within us a longing for the infinite, a longing that no material success can ever fully satisfy. This helps explain why so many people, even after achieving success, wealth, or recognition, still feel a quiet sense of dissatisfaction. In Thoughts, Pascal observes that human beings often seek distractions to avoid facing life's biggest questions. Endless work, constant entertainment, the non-stop search for new experiences, and even personal ambitions can become ways of escaping the reality of our own mortality. Not because these things are bad in themselves, but because they often hide a deeper fear, the fear of being alone with questions we cannot answer. It is in this context that Pascal's wager takes on a much broader meaning. It is not simply an argument meant to persuade people to believe in God. It is also a reminder that no one lives without making existential choices. Everyone places their trust in something. Some bet that the universe has a purpose. Others bet that everything ends with death. Some put their hope in science, progress, career success, or relationships. Whether we realize it or not, each of us builds our lives around a belief about what is ultimately true and valuable. Naturally, this idea has faced many criticisms over the centuries. Some philosophers have asked whether a belief based mainly on caution could truly please God. Others have questioned which religion someone should choose, since different faiths make different claims about God. These objections show that Pascal did not solve the problem of faith once and for all. But perhaps that was never his goal. His real purpose seems to be something else. To make us realize that complete neutrality about life's biggest questions is impossible. Even deciding to ignore those questions is in itself a practical answer. As life moves forward, Every choice reveals where we have truly placed our trust. Another fascinating part of Pascal's philosophy is his deep intellectual humility. Even though he was one of the greatest scientists of his time, he never believed that human reason alone could answer every fundamental question. There are limits that mathematics, physics, and even philosophy cannot completely overcome. This does not reduce the value of human intelligence. It simply reminds us that mystery is part of what it means to be human. Perhaps that is why Pascal's ideas remain so relevant today. We live in an age overflowing with information, yet we are still surrounded by the same essential questions. Is there a purpose to our existence? Is there something beyond what we can measure and observe? What is truly worth placing at the center of our lives? Blaise Pascal does not hand us easy answers to these questions. Instead, he reminds us that every human being, whether they realize it or not, is already placing a bet every single day. The question that remains is deeply personal. When the time comes to look back on your life as a whole, what will you have chosen to bet on? Imagine for a moment that every traditional idea about God was set aside. No heavenly throne, no supernatural interventions, no being watching every human action and deciding who should be rewarded or punished. What would be left? For Baruch Spinoza, this question did not destroy the idea of God, it completely transformed it. Instead of seeing God as a being separate from the universe, he proposed one of the boldest ideas in the history of philosophy. God is not outside of nature. God is nature. When Spinoza published his book Ethics in the 17th century, his ideas were considered so radical that they shocked both religious leaders and intellectuals. He was accused of being an atheist, even though he never denied God's existence. That is the paradox. Spinoza deeply believed in God, but he rejected the traditional image of a personal God who makes decisions, changes his mind, experiences emotions, or constantly intervenes in the world. To him, that picture was simply a projection of human qualities onto something infinite. At the heart of his philosophy is a famous Latin phrase, Deus sive natura, which means God or nature. These three words summarize a philosophical revolution. God and nature are not two separate realities. There is only one infinite, eternal, and absolutely necessary substance. Everything that exists is part of this one reality. Mountains, oceans, stars, animals, plants, and even human beings are not separate creations made by God. They are expressions of the same infinite reality. This idea requires a major shift in the way we usually think. In many religious traditions, there is a clear distinction between the Creator and creation. God exists above the universe, while the universe depends on him to exist. Spinoza removes that separation. For him, it makes no sense to imagine God as someone who created the universe at a certain point in time. The universe is not something God made. It is the very expression of God's nature. This also means that God does not have a will in the human sense of the word. He does not decide to create one planet today and another tomorrow. He does not change his plans because circumstances change. He does not feel anger, regret, or favoritism. According to Spinoza, all of these are human traits and cannot be applied to something infinite. The more we imagine God as a giant human being, the farther we move away from understanding his true nature. This view also completely changes the way we think about miracles. In his theological political treatise, Spinoza argues that the laws of nature express God's very essence. If God is nature itself, then acting against those laws would mean acting against his own nature, which would make no sense. For this reason, what we call a miracle usually reflects our lack of understanding about how reality works. When we cannot explain a certain event, we tend to label it as supernatural. As knowledge advances, we often discover that these events follow natural causes we simply did not understand before. This idea is not meant to reduce the wonder of the universe. Quite the opposite. For Spinoza, understanding the laws of nature is a way of knowing God. Every scientific discovery, every step forward in reason, and every deeper understanding of reality brings human beings closer to what is highest. Studying nature becomes more than an intellectual activity. It becomes something almost spiritual. Another revolutionary part of his philosophy is the way he understands freedom. We usually think we are free because we can choose between different options. Spinoza challenges that assumption. According to him, everything that happens has a cause. Our thoughts, emotions, desires, and decisions are all part of the great chain of causes that shapes reality. In a sense, everything happens out of necessity. At first, this seems to leave no room for human freedom. But Spinoza completely redefines what freedom means. For him, a person is truly free not when they act without causes, but when they understand the causes that shape them. The more we understand why we feel fear, jealousy, anger, or ambition, the less those emotions control us. Knowledge does not destroy freedom, it makes freedom possible. This idea has profound consequences for the way we deal with our emotions. Instead of seeing feelings as mysterious forces that simply appear, Spinoza encourages us to examine them through reason. Sadness, hatred, and resentment stop being supernatural enemies and become natural experiences that can be understood. Centuries later, this approach would influence several schools of modern psychology, especially those that emphasize self-awareness as the path to a healthier and more balanced life. In ethics, Spinoza also presents a surprising view of happiness. Instead of searching for it through wealth, status, or temporary pleasures, he argues that true joy comes from increasing our ability to exist and to understand. The more we understand our place within the order of nature, the more inner peace we experience. Happiness no longer depends on external circumstances, but grows out of living in harmony with reality. This way of thinking requires a major change in perspective. Many people spend much of their lives fighting against things they cannot control. They suffer trying to change the past, resisting the inevitable, or holding on to impossible expectations. Spinoza offers another path, understanding the necessity that governs the universe. This does not mean passively accepting every situation. It means letting go of the illusion that reality should always match our personal desires. At the same time, his philosophy does not lead to pessimism. Quite the opposite. When we stop seeing the universe as a collection of random events or as a stage for divine punishment, we begin to appreciate the extraordinary unity of everything that exists. Human beings no longer stand apart from reality, but recognize that they are part of something infinitely greater. This understanding leads to what Spinoza calls the intellectual love of God. It is not a devotion based on fear or the hope of future rewards. Instead, it is a feeling that grows from a deep understanding of the order of the universe. The more we understand reality, the more we admire its harmony and beauty. That understanding gives rise to a kind of love that does not depend on rituals, promises, or external obligations. It is easy to see why Spinoza's ideas caused so much controversy. By removing human characteristics from God, he seemed to break with centuries of religious tradition. Yet many later thinkers found in his philosophy a completely new way to bring together spirituality and reason. One of them was Albert Einstein, who famously said he admired Spinoza's God, the God revealed in the harmony of the laws of nature, not a God who directly intervenes in people's personal lives. More than 3 centuries later, Spinoza's ideas continue to inspire intense debate. When we look at the vastness of the universe, the complexity of life, or the elegance of the laws that govern nature, are we simply observing physical processes, or are we experiencing something deeply sacred? Spinoza does not invite us to search for God in some distant place. His challenge is far more radical. Perhaps every part of reality has always been an expression of the infinite, waiting for us to learn to see it in an entirely new way. For centuries, Stories of miracles have been presented as some of the strongest evidence for the existence of God. Unexplained healings, extraordinary events, and supernatural phenomena have strengthened the faith of millions of people and shaped religious traditions around the world. But there is one question that very few people have been willing to follow to its logical conclusion. How can we know if a miracle really happened? David Hume tackled this question directly. Instead of asking whether miracles are possible, he asked something even more important. Is it rational to believe the testimony of people who claim they happened? In his book, An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, Hume develops an argument that would deeply influence the philosophy of religion. His goal is not to mock faith or prove that God does not exist. Instead, he focused on how we form our beliefs. After all, whenever we accept something as true, we do so because we believe we have good reasons to trust it. The real question is, what kind of reasons are actually strong enough to justify that trust? Hume begins with a basic fact about human experience. We learn by observing patterns. We know that fire produces heat because we have always seen it do so. We expect the sun to rise tomorrow because it has done so every day throughout history. Our confidence in the laws of nature does not come from absolute logical proof, but from repeated experience. The more consistently something happens, the more we expect it to keep happening. This is exactly where the problem of miracles begins. By definition, a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature. If all of human experience tells us that certain natural laws always operate in the same way, how likely is it that they were suspended in one particular case? According to Hume, before accepting a miraculous story, we have to compare two possibilities. The first is that the laws of nature were genuinely broken. The second is that the testimony is mistaken, exaggerated, or even false. His conclusion became one of the most famous statements in philosophy. No testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle, unless its falsehood would be even more miraculous than the event it is trying to prove. In other words, for it to be rational to believe in a miracle, the possibility that the witness was mistaken, deceived, or lying would have to be even less likely than the miracle itself. This reasoning is not based on prejudice against religion. It comes from a general principle about how we evaluate evidence. Imagine someone tells you they watched a rock float in the air for several minutes. Your first reaction would probably be to look for another explanation. Maybe it was an optical illusion. Maybe there was some hidden mechanism. Or maybe the story changed as it was passed from person to person. We don't do this because we automatically reject anything unusual. We do it because all of our previous experience tells us that rocks do not normally float. Hume argues that the same standard should be applied to religious miracle stories. Many of these accounts come from ancient testimony, passed down through generations, and often written during times when methods of investigation were very limited. He also points out another important fact. Human beings have a natural tendency to believe and share extraordinary stories. The more surprising a story is, the more emotional impact it has, and the more likely it is to spread. According to Hume, this helps explain why miraculous stories appear in so many different cultures. Sincere people may interpret ordinary events as supernatural because they want to find a deeper meaning in what they experienced. In other cases, small events become bigger and more dramatic as they are retold over time. We do not have to assume bad intentions to understand how stories can grow with each retelling. In Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, Hume expands his criticism by examining the traditional arguments used to prove God's existence through reason. Through fictional characters representing different philosophical positions, he asks how much we can really conclude about God's nature simply by observing the world. If we see order in the universe, does that truly prove the existence of a perfect creator? Or are we simply projecting our own ways of thinking onto a universe whose true origin remains unknown? This approach reveals one of Hume's defining characteristics, his deep skepticism. But it is important to understand what that really means. Hume is not saying we should doubt everything without reason. His skepticism is an invitation to intellectual caution. Before accepting any extraordinary claim, we should ask what evidence actually supports it. The more extraordinary the claim, the stronger the evidence needs to be. This way of thinking had a major influence on the development of modern science. Science also works through hypotheses, observation, testing, and constant revision. No theory is accepted simply because it sounds convincing or feels emotionally satisfying. It must survive careful examination, repeated testing, and comparison with observable facts. In that sense, Hume helped strengthen an intellectual culture built on careful investigation rather than the immediate acceptance of impressive claims. At the same time, his philosophy does not eliminate the mysteries of existence. On the contrary, Hume acknowledges that there are many questions for which we do not have definite answers. His goal is not to replace faith with absolute certainty through reason, but to honestly recognize the limits of human knowledge. We often want quick answers to life's deepest questions, yet reality may be far more complex than our explanations can fully capture. This recognition of our limits also appears in Hume's discussion of cause and effect. We usually believe that certain events necessarily produce other events. But according to Hume, what we actually observe is only that one event regularly follows another. The idea of a necessary connection comes from the habits of our minds, not from direct observation. This conclusion became one of the greatest turning points in modern philosophy, and later influenced thinkers such as Immanuel Kant, who famously said that Hume awakened him from his dogmatic slumber. Hume's ideas remain especially relevant today, in a world where information spreads instantly. Every day we encounter extraordinary news stories, impressive videos, emotional testimonies, and bold claims that promise to explain surprising events. His philosophy reminds us that excitement should never replace careful thinking. Emotion may spark our curiosity, but it is not enough to establish the truth. At the same time, Hume does not encourage cynicism. He does not claim that everything is false or that religious experiences have no value. His goal is both simpler and more demanding: to develop an intellectual attitude based on honesty toward the evidence. Knowing when we truly know something is important, but admitting when we do not know may be even harder. This willingness to live with uncertainty may be one of Hume's greatest contributions. Instead of rushing to fill every gap with comforting explanations, he teaches us to bear the weight of unanswered questions while remaining committed to rational inquiry. After all, when we hear an extraordinary story, the real challenge is not deciding immediately whether to believe it or reject it. The real challenge is asking whether our reasons for accepting it are truly as extraordinary as the story itself. There are moments when human reason seems to reach a boundary it cannot cross. The more we explore life's biggest questions, the more we realize that some of them resist even our best explanations. We can study the universe, understand the laws of nature, and develop sophisticated theories about reality. But can reason alone ever give us a definite answer to whether God exists? Immanuel Kant believed this was one of the most important questions in philosophy, but also one of the most dangerous. Instead of trying to prove or disprove God's existence, he decided to examine a more basic question first: how far can human reason actually go? In his groundbreaking work, Critique of Pure Reason, Kant introduced a revolution in the way we think about knowledge. For centuries, philosophers had argued over whether God's existence could be proven through logic or by observing the world. Kant realized that they might all be making the same mistake. Before asking what we can know, we first need to ask what the limits of human knowledge actually are. His starting point is surprisingly simple. All human knowledge begins with experience, but it does not come entirely from experience. When we observe the world, our minds do not work like mirrors that simply record information. Instead, Our minds organize what we experience using built-in structures, such as space, time, and categories of understanding. In other words, we do not know reality exactly as it is in itself. We know reality as our minds are able to perceive it. This distinction became one of the most influential ideas in modern philosophy. Kant separates phenomena, which are things as they appear to us, from what he calls the noumenon, or reality as it exists independently of our perception. The problem is that all rational investigation depends on experience. Since God is not part of our sensory experience, theoretical reason has no way to prove that God exists or to prove that he does not. This conclusion completely changed the philosophical debate. Kant carefully examines the main arguments that had been used throughout history to prove God's existence: the ontological argument, the cosmological argument, and the teleological argument, and concludes that they all go beyond the proper limits of reason. Not because they are irrational, but because they try to apply concepts from the observable world to a reality that lies beyond human experience. Does this mean Kant was an atheist? Not at all. His criticism does not destroy the idea of God. It simply gives it a different place within philosophy. For Kant, reason must recognize its own limits. There is a huge difference between saying, "I cannot prove this," and saying, "This does not exist." Intellectual honesty requires us to admit when a question goes beyond what human knowledge can answer. But Kant's thinking does not stop there. After arguing that God cannot be proven through theoretical reason, he makes an unexpected move in critique of practical reason. Instead of asking what we can know, he asks another question: how should we live? This is where morality enters the picture. Kant observed that every human being experiences a sense of duty. Even when doing the right thing comes at a personal cost, we still feel that some actions simply ought to be done. This sense of duty does not depend on emotions, personal interests, or rewards. It presents itself as a universal demand of practical reason. This idea appears in his famous concept of the categorical imperative. Put simply, Kant argues that we should act only according to principles that we would want everyone else to follow as well. Before telling a lie, for example, we should ask ourselves, what if everyone always lied? Trust between people would disappear. In this way, some actions reveal themselves to be morally inconsistent when applied universally. But this leads to another problem. In the real world, good people often suffer, while dishonest people sometimes succeed. If morality requires us to do what is right, does it make sense to believe that the universe is completely indifferent to justice? Kant answers that practical reason itself leads us to accept certain ideas that cannot be proven theoretically, but are necessary if moral life is to make sense. One of those ideas is God. For Kant, God is not a scientific conclusion, but a postulate of practical reason. In other words, the existence of a perfectly just being allows us to believe that goodness and happiness can ultimately be brought into harmony, even if that does not fully happen in this life. Without that possibility, the pursuit of justice would seem, in the end, to have no ultimate foundation. Along with God, Kant also argues that two other ideas are necessary: freedom and the immortality of the soul. Freedom is essential because it would make no sense to hold people morally responsible for actions they had no choice but to perform. The immortality of the soul allows us to think of moral growth as something that continues beyond the limits of a single lifetime. None of these ideas can be proven by theoretical reason, but all of them play an essential role in the structure of moral life. This distinction between knowledge and morality may be Kant's greatest contribution to the philosophy of religion. He does not ask us to abandon reason in order to believe in God, but he also refuses to let reason go beyond its proper limits. In his view, faith is not a substitute for knowledge. Instead, it belongs to a different part of human life, one connected to moral responsibility and the search for meaning. This perspective requires remarkable intellectual humility. Rather than offering final answers to every question, Kant teaches that recognizing the limits of human thought is itself a form of wisdom. Not every important question can be answered with mathematical certainty. Some belong to the world of freedom, responsibility, and the choices each of us makes throughout life. His influence extends far beyond philosophy. By clearly defining the limits of what reason can claim, Kant opened the door to new discussions about science, ethics, religion, and knowledge itself. Many later philosophers agreed with his conclusions, while others tried to challenge them, but very few were able to ignore them. Perhaps the greatest strength of Kant's philosophy lies in this change of perspective. Instead of treating God as an object that could be studied like any other part of nature, he reminds us that some questions remain important even if they cannot be answered with absolute proof. The real issue is not simply whether God can be proven through reason. It is recognizing that reason itself, when examined honestly, reveals both its extraordinary power and its clear limits. And interestingly, it is precisely where knowledge reaches those limits that the question of God stops being just a debate of arguments and becomes something deeply connected to each person's moral conscience. There comes a point when every explanation seems to fall short. Logic offers arguments, philosophy builds complex systems, and science continues to expand our understanding of the universe. Even so, there are still questions that no proof can fully answer. What happens when reason reaches its limit, yet we still have to make a decision? This is exactly where Kierkegaard focused his entire philosophy. For him, true faith is not born when all doubt disappears. It begins precisely when no rational certainty is enough to support the decision. Kierkegaard wrote during a time when confidence in human reason was rapidly growing. Many philosophers believed it was possible to explain reality through complete logical systems. Even Christianity was starting to be treated in some intellectual circles as a set of doctrines that could be fully explained through reason. Kierkegaard saw this as a serious danger. In his view, turning faith into a purely intellectual exercise stripped away its most essential quality, its deeply personal nature. This criticism is especially powerful in Fear and Trembling, perhaps his best-known work. Instead of presenting abstract arguments, Kierkegaard reflects on one of the most disturbing stories in the Bible, the moment when God commands Abraham to sacrifice his son, Isaac. No matter what a reader believes, this story raises difficult questions. How could a man considered righteous accept a command that seems to go against logic, morality, and basic human compassion? That discomfort is exactly what interests Kierkegaard. For him, Abraham's story should not be seen as an example of blind obedience, but as the ultimate picture of the conflict between human reason and faith. From an ethical point of view, Abraham's decision makes no sense. No moral rule can justify it. No rational argument can remove the paradox at the center of the story. Yet Abraham moves forward because he trusts God, even though he cannot understand God's purpose. Kierkegaard calls this the leap of faith. The image is powerful. When someone jumps, they leave the safety of solid ground and enter a moment of complete uncertainty. There is no absolute guarantee that everything will work out. In the same way, faith is not about walking on undeniable evidence. It requires a commitment that goes beyond what logic can prove. It is important to understand that Kierkegaard is not telling us to abandon reason. He is not saying we should believe anything without thinking. His argument is much more subtle. Reason is extremely valuable, but there comes a point where it can no longer provide enough answers for certain life-changing decisions. Falling in love, for example, is never based only on rational calculations. Fully trusting another person also involves a risk that no amount of evidence can completely remove. According to Kierkegaard, faith belongs to this same category of choices that require our whole being. This perspective completely changes the meaning of religious belief. Instead of seeing faith as simply accepting doctrines or traditions, Kierkegaard understands it as a living relationship between the individual and God. It is an experience that no one else can have for us. No one can believe on our behalf. No one can take responsibility for the biggest decisions of our lives. This focus on the individual also appears in philosophical fragments. In this work, Kierkegaard challenges the idea that the most important truths can be communicated as objective information. Knowing something intellectually is not the same as living that truth. A person can study religious texts for years, spend decades learning philosophy, and still never experience a genuine relationship with what they claim to believe. That is why Kierkegaard makes an important distinction between objective truth and subjective truth. Objective truth concerns facts that can be demonstrated and shared with others. Subjective truth is about the way each individual relates personally to what they believe is true. This relationship requires passion, commitment, and personal involvement. For Kierkegaard, a faith practiced only because of culture or family tradition can hardly be called genuine faith. This leads to another key idea in his philosophy: anxiety. Unlike fear, which always has a specific object, anxiety comes from facing the endless possibilities of life. Human beings are free to choose, and that freedom carries a heavy burden. Every decision closes the door to countless other possibilities. Every choice shapes the direction of our lives. There is no guidebook that can completely remove this responsibility. According to Kierkegaard, many people try to escape this anxiety by living on autopilot. They follow the opinions of the crowd, repeat social habits, or hide behind ready-made rules. But authenticity requires facing the discomfort of freedom. Faith is part of that process as well. It does not remove anxiety. In many ways, it makes it even stronger because it forces each person to make a decision that no one else can fully justify for them. This makes Kierkegaard's philosophy especially relevant today. We live in a world where almost anything can be researched in seconds. We look for opinions, statistics, expert advice, and endless information before making important decisions. Yet there are still moments when no amount of information can replace the need to choose. To stay or leave. To forgive or hold on to resentment. To trust or give up. Some decisions will always involve uncertainty. Kierkegaard believed that faith belongs exactly to this part of human life. It is not the unavoidable conclusion of logic, but a free response to God's call. That is why faith can never be forced, mathematically proven, or inherited as a simple tradition. Every individual must walk that path personally. At the same time, Kierkegaard does not romanticize this journey. In Fear and Trembling, Abraham is not portrayed as a calm, confident hero. The title of the book itself reflects his inner struggle. He experiences fear and trembling because his decision involves suffering, uncertainty, and deep inner conflict. True faith does not erase doubt. It learns to keep moving forward without having every answer. This understanding had a profound influence on existentialism in many later thinkers. By placing individual experience at the center of philosophy, Kierkegaard showed that life's most important questions cannot be solved only through books or academic debates. They demand an existential answer, expressed through the choices we make. His philosophy remains deeply challenging because it confronts a common expectation, that we should only act once every doubt has been resolved. Kierkegaard reminds us that this moment may never come. Some decisions have to be made even in the middle of uncertainty. And perhaps that is where faith reveals its deepest meaning, not as the absence of questions, but as the courage to keep moving forward after reason has shown everything it can, and the next step depends entirely on trust. Few statements in the history of philosophy have been as misunderstood as Friedrich Nietzsche's famous declaration, "God is dead." Many people take it as nothing more than a statement of atheism or an attack on religion. But Nietzsche meant something much deeper and much more unsettling. His goal was not to prove that God doesn't exist. Instead, he wanted to show that Western culture had stopped living as if God were the foundation of its existence. The real issue was not the death of God itself, but what would happen to humanity afterward. This idea appears most clearly in the gay science, especially in the famous passage known as the madman. In it, a man walks into a town square, carrying a lit lantern in broad daylight, searching for God. The people laugh at him, thinking his search is ridiculous. Then he announces, "We have killed him, you and I." The power of this scene lies in its symbolism. Nietzsche is not describing a literal death. He is saying that human beings themselves, through cultural, scientific, and philosophical changes, removed God from the center of public and intellectual life. For centuries, morality, politics, art, and the meaning of life were deeply connected to religion. People believed that right and wrong had an absolute foundation established by God. As science, historical criticism, and modern philosophy advanced, that foundation began to weaken. Nietzsche realized that society was still living by values inherited from Christianity, even though it no longer fully believed in where those values came from. It was like living in a house whose foundation had already been removed. That is why the phrase "God is dead" is not meant as a celebration. In many places, Nietzsche writes about this event in an almost tragic tone. The loss of a religious foundation does not automatically bring freedom or happiness. On the contrary, it creates a massive crisis of meaning. If God is no longer the source of morality, who decides what is right and wrong? On what foundation will we build our values? How do we keep everything from becoming completely relative? These questions run through much of Nietzsche's work. He realized that many people believed they were freeing humanity from religion, but very few had stopped to consider the consequences of that freedom. Losing an absolute foundation could open the door to extraordinary creativity, but it could also lead to a deep sense of emptiness. It is this emptiness that Nietzsche saw as one of the greatest dangers of the modern world. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche offers a bold response to this problem. Instead of searching for new foundations outside ourselves, he argues that human beings must take responsibility for creating their own values. This is where the idea of the Übermensch, often translated as the Overman or Superman, comes in. Unfortunately, this concept has been misunderstood many times throughout history. Nietzsche is not talking about racial, political, or physical superiority. The Overman represents someone who can move beyond inherited values without falling into despair or simply conforming. According to Nietzsche, most people prefer to follow ready-made rules because they provide a sense of security. Creating new values requires courage, responsibility, and a willingness to face loneliness. The Overman symbolizes the ability to turn one's own life into a creative work without depending on truths handed down by outside authorities. This idea is closely connected to Nietzsche's criticism of what he calls herd morality. In his view, many moral rules developed less from a desire for human excellence and more from the need to control groups of people. In the Antichrist, his criticism of Christianity becomes especially intense. He argues that Christian tradition glorifies humility, resignation, and suffering in ways that, in his opinion, weaken the individual's creative strength. It is important to understand that this criticism is not directed only at organized religion. Nietzsche questions any system that encourages blind obedience or discourages people from fully developing their potential. His main target is not God as a philosophical idea, but anything that prevents individuals from taking complete responsibility for their own lives. Another key concept in his philosophy is nihilism. This term describes the condition in which old values no longer seem convincing, yet no new source of meaning has taken their place. Nihilism does not simply mean believing in nothing. It is a much deeper experience, the feeling that life has lost any objective purpose. Nietzsche believed that Western culture was moving in exactly this direction. As old certainties disappear, many people experience a profound inner emptiness. Some try to fill that emptiness with wealth, power, fame, or constant entertainment. Others turn to new ideologies to replace old religious beliefs. But for Nietzsche, none of these solutions truly solve the problem if they still depend on values imposed from the outside. It is in this context that another of his most powerful ideas appears: amor fati, a Latin phrase meaning love of fate. Instead of complaining about whatever life brings, Nietzsche encourages a radical attitude of acceptance. This is not passive resignation. It is the ability to embrace life in all its complexity, including suffering, failure, and hardship. True strength does not come from wishing for a different life. It comes from saying yes to the life you actually have. This idea connects directly with one of Nietzsche's most famous thought experiments, the eternal recurrence. He asks readers to imagine that one day someone tells them they will have to live the exact same life, with every detail over, and over again forever. This is not meant as a literal description of how the universe works. It is an existential test. If the thought of repeating your life forever fills you with despair, perhaps you are not yet living in a way that you truly embrace. Even those who disagree with Nietzsche rarely remain indifferent to his ideas. He forces readers to confront uncomfortable questions that are still deeply relevant today. In a society where many different worldviews exist side by side, where do our values really come from? Are we simply repeating beliefs we inherited, or have we truly reflected on what we believe is right and wrong? His influence extended far beyond philosophy, shaping psychology, literature, art, and nearly every area of the humanities. Many later thinkers agreed with his criticisms, while others devoted their work to answering the challenges he raised. Much of 20th century existentialism grew directly from the questions Nietzsche left unanswered. Perhaps the greatest strength of Nietzsche's philosophy is its refusal to offer easy answers. In his thought, the death of God does not mark the end of a religious debate. It marks the beginning of a new responsibility. When there is no longer an absolute authority to define the meaning of life, each individual must face the difficult task of answering one of the biggest questions of all. What values are truly worth building a life on? At that moment, Nietzsche becomes much more than a critic of religion. He becomes one of the philosophers who most deeply challenged humanity to reflect on the weight of freedom, the creation of meaning, and personal responsibility for one's own destiny. When every authority disappears and no law seems to have an absolute foundation, what stops people from doing whatever they want? This is one of the most unsettling questions raised by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Although he is remembered as one of the greatest novelists in world literature, his work is also a profound philosophical exploration of human nature. Through his characters, great ideas stop being abstract concepts and become real voices filled with emotions, conflicts, and consequences. That is why the question so often associated with his thought, "If God doesn't exist, is everything permitted?" continues to spark debate to this day. Interestingly, this exact phrase never appears in his novels, but it perfectly captures one of the central dilemmas of his philosophy. Dostoevsky was not trying to offer a quick answer. He wanted to explore what happens to the human conscience when belief in a higher moral foundation disappears. If there is no absolute good, does morality still have real authority, or does it become nothing more than a set of rules created by society? This tension runs throughout the brothers Karamazov, which many consider his greatest masterpiece. Among the novel's many characters, Ivan Karamazov represents the intellectual who is deeply troubled by the contradictions of life. He does not reject God out of pride or arrogance. His struggle comes from his inability to accept a world where innocent children suffer and terrible injustices seem to have no explanation. For Ivan, the problem is not simply whether God exists, but the moral cost of accepting a world filled with so much suffering. In one of the novel's most famous chapters, The Grand Inquisitor, Dostoevsky tells an extraordinary story. In it, Christ returns to earth during the Spanish Inquisition, but is immediately arrested by the religious authorities. The Grand Inquisitor argues that humanity does not truly want the freedom Christ offers. People would rather have security, authority, and certainty, even if it means giving up their freedom. This story is not just a criticism of religious institutions. It explores something much deeper about human nature. Many people fear freedom because it forces them to take responsibility for their own choices. The connection between freedom and responsibility is also at the heart of crime and punishment. The main character, Rodion Raskolnikov, develops the theory that extraordinary individuals have the right to break ordinary moral rules if doing so serves a greater purpose. Convinced of this idea, he murders a pawnbroker, believing his actions are logically justified. But what begins as a rational experiment quickly turns into a psychological nightmare. The most fascinating part is that Raskolnikov is not destroyed by the police or by the physical evidence of his crime. His real trial takes place inside his own conscience. Guilt slowly consumes him, destroying his peace of mind, his clarity of thought, and his ability to live a normal life. Dostoevsky shows that human beings are not rational machines capable of ignoring the moral consequences of their actions simply because they have invented a convincing theory. This reveals one of the most important ideas in his philosophy. Moral conscience is not just something imposed from the outside. There is something deep within us that reacts when we violate what we know to be right. Even if no one ever discovers our mistakes, we still have to live with ourselves. It is in this silent courtroom of the human conscience that Dostoevsky places one of the greatest dramas of human existence. Throughout his novels, Dostoevsky rejects any simplistic view of human nature. He does not believe people are naturally good or naturally evil. Every person carries both possibilities within them. We are capable of incredible generosity, but also of terrible cruelty. This makes freedom an extraordinary gift, but also an enormous risk. Freedom allows us to love, create, and improve the world, but it also makes selfishness, violence, and destruction possible. Dostoevsky believed that many thinkers of his time placed too much confidence in human reason. The idea that society could eliminate evil simply by organizing itself more rationally seemed deeply naive to him. The human problem is not just a lack of knowledge. Intelligent people also lie, betray, manipulate others, and commit injustice. The real moral struggle happens much deeper within the human will itself. This criticism appears again and again in his characters. They rarely make mistakes because they are ignorant. Most of the time, they know exactly what they should do, but they choose a different path anyway. This conflict between conscience and desire makes his novels remarkable studies of human psychology, written long before the rise of psychoanalysis. Another important part of his philosophy is the role of suffering. Unlike those who see pain only as something to be avoided, Dostoevsky believed that suffering could reveal profound truths about life. In Crime and Punishment, it is through suffering that Raskolnikov slowly begins to recognize his own limits and rebuild his humanity. In this context, suffering is not portrayed as an arbitrary punishment, but as part of a person's inner transformation. At the same time, Dostoevsky never romanticizes pain. He knew suffering firsthand. He was sentenced to death, endured the terror of a mock execution, spent years in a Siberian prison camp, and experienced devastating personal losses. His reflections do not come from abstract theories, but from direct experience with the darkest parts of human life. Perhaps that is why his characters feel so real. They struggle with the same questions that he himself knew so well. At the center of all these reflections remains the question of God. For Dostoevsky, religion is never just an intellectual issue. It has real consequences for the way we live. If God does not exist, where does the inviolable dignity of every human being come from? What gives moral obligation its foundation? Is it possible to build an ethical system completely independent of any higher reality? Rather than giving simple answers, his novels explore these questions through the lives of his characters. This literary approach is exactly what makes his philosophy so powerful. Dostoevsky does not write systematic philosophical treatises. Instead, he allows different worldviews to clash, letting each character follow their beliefs to their ultimate conclusions. Readers are not handed ready-made answers. They are invited to wrestle with these questions themselves. His work remains incredibly relevant today. We live in an age of unprecedented personal freedom, yet we also face deep crises of meaning. Many traditional sources of guidance have lost their influence, while new ways of thinking about morality are still taking shape. In this environment, Dostoevsky's questions remain as powerful as ever. What truly guides our choices when no one is watching? Is there a responsibility that goes beyond human laws? Is our moral conscience simply the result of culture, or does it point to something deeper? Perhaps this is the greatest contribution of his work. Rather than offering comforting answers, Dostoevsky forces every reader to look inward. After all, the real conflict between good and evil does not happen only in institutions, political systems, or major historical events. It happens quietly within every human conscience. Every time freedom meets responsibility, and we must decide what kind of person we want to become. Throughout history, many philosophers devoted their efforts to defending the existence of God through reason. Bertrand Russell chose the opposite path. Instead of looking for new arguments to justify faith, he asked whether the traditional arguments actually hold up under careful logical analysis. His goal was not to attack religious people or make fun of spirituality. What Russell wanted was something he believed was essential to any philosophical investigation, accepting only what can be supported by solid evidence and sound reasoning. This approach is clearly presented in his lecture, later published as the book Why I'm Not a Christian, one of the most influential works of skeptical thought in the 20th century. Right from the beginning, Russell makes an important point. Before discussing whether Christianity is true, we first need to define what it means to be a Christian. For him, it was not enough to admire Jesus' moral teachings or belong to a religious tradition. Being a Christian meant believing certain fundamental claims, such as the existence of God and the divinity of Christ. Those were the very claims he set out to examine. Russell believed that no idea should be beyond questioning. Just as we evaluate scientific theories, philosophical ideas, or political decisions, we should also examine religious beliefs with a critical mind. If an argument is truly strong, it should remain convincing even when faced with the toughest questions. If it cannot, then perhaps it needs to be reconsidered. One of Russell's first critiques focuses on the first cause argument, which had been widely used throughout the history of philosophy. This argument says that everything that exists has a cause, so the universe itself must also have a first cause, identified as God. Russell points out a logical problem with this reasoning. If everything needs a cause, then God would also need one. But if we are willing to accept that God can exist without a cause, then why not accept that the universe itself could exist in the same way? To Russell, this argument simply stops the chain of explanations at the very point it is trying to prove. He then examines the argument from natural law, which claims that the order found in the universe points to the existence of a divine lawgiver. Russell argues that modern science offers a different way of understanding this order. The laws of nature are not commands issued by an authority. They are descriptions of how natural phenomena consistently behave. He also points out that asking who created the laws of nature only pushes the question back one step without truly answering it. Another target of his criticism is the design argument, which compares the universe to a carefully designed machine. If we find a watch, we naturally assume there was a watchmaker. In the same way, the complexity of the universe seems to suggest an intelligent creator. Russell responds by pointing out that the universe also contains many imperfections. Natural disasters, diseases, suffering, and mass extinctions have all been part of life's history. If we follow the design analogy, he argues, it becomes difficult to claim that we are looking at a perfectly designed creation. This leads Russell to one of the most difficult topics in the philosophy of religion, the problem of evil. If God is infinitely good, all-powerful, and all-wise, why is there so much suffering in the world? Many philosophers had raised this question before him, but Russell uses it as a direct challenge to traditional ideas about divine providence. In his view, the amount of pain and suffering found in nature makes it difficult to reconcile certain attributes traditionally assigned to God with the world we actually observe. At the same time, Russell is careful to distinguish between two debates that are often mixed together. One question is whether God exists. A very different question is whether certain religious traditions are morally good. Even if someone accepted the existence of God, that alone would not settle every issue involving religious institutions, interpretations of Scripture, or actions carried out in the name of faith. In this area, Russell strongly criticizes the historical role played by many religious institutions. In his view, throughout history, some of them helped limit freedom of thought, opposed scientific progress, and supported systems of intolerance. That does not mean every religious person behaved this way, but rather that certain institutions used religion to justify persecution and resist important social changes. At the same time, Russell openly acknowledged that many deeply religious individuals lived admirable lives. His criticism was aimed mainly at ideas and institutions, not at the character of specific people. This distinction highlights an important feature of his philosophical method, separating arguments from the emotions they often provoke. Another defining feature of Russell's thinking is his defense of rational skepticism. He believed that doubt is not an intellectual weakness, but a virtue. Instead of seeking absolute certainty about everything, we should learn to live with different levels of probability. Some questions can be answered with a high degree of confidence, while others remain open, because there is not enough evidence. Recognizing this difference is, for Russell, a sign of intellectual honesty. This attitude also shaped his understanding of science. Scientific knowledge does not advance because it discovers final, unquestionable truths. It advances because it remains willing to revise its conclusions whenever new evidence appears. Russell admired this ability to correct mistakes without treating any theory as untouchable. He believed this mindset should serve as a model for every field of human thought. His monumental history of Western philosophy reflects the same commitment to critical inquiry. Rather than treating philosophers as unquestionable authorities, Russell examines their ideas by highlighting both their strengths and their weaknesses. Progress in human thought depends precisely on this willingness to examine even the most respected theories. Despite his religious skepticism, Russell did not argue for a life without values. On the contrary, he believed that principles such as compassion, justice, cooperation, and respect for human dignity can be developed through reason without relying on a supernatural foundation. In his view, ethics grows out of our ability to understand the consequences of our actions and recognize the importance of the well-being of others. This position sparked intense debate. Many philosophers and theologians argued that without an absolute foundation, morality risks becoming relative. Russell replied that simply claiming a moral rule comes from divine authority does not automatically settle every ethical question. We still need to think carefully about what we believe is right and wrong. His defense of intellectual freedom remains just as relevant today. Russell insisted that no belief should be protected from criticism simply because of tradition, authority, or popularity. A genuine commitment to truth requires the willingness to hear opposing arguments, reconsider our opinions, and admit when the evidence points in a different direction. Perhaps that is Russell's greatest philosophical contribution. No matter what conclusions someone reaches about God or religion, he reminds us that thinking requires courage. The courage to ask difficult questions, to let go of weak certainties when necessary, and to accept that some answers may always remain provisional. In a world where opinions are often defended with more passion than reflection, Russell's philosophy still presents a powerful challenge. Do we hold our beliefs because we have truly examined the reasons behind them, or simply because we have never had the courage to test them through careful, critical thinking? Some questions have followed humanity since the time of the first philosophers, and still have no final answer. One of the hardest is this: is it possible to find meaning in life without believing in a divine purpose? For many religious traditions, God provides an explanation for suffering, death, and existence itself. But Albert Camus chose a completely different path. Instead of looking for a transcendent answer, he asked whether human beings could live fully even in a universe that remains silent. Camus develops this idea mainly in the myth of Sisyphus, a work he described as an essay on the absurd. Right at the beginning, he makes a bold statement. There is only one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is whether life is worth living. This statement is not meant to encourage despair. Instead, it shows that every philosophy must first answer the question of life's meaning. To understand his answer, we first need to understand what Camus means by the absurd. Many people think the absurd means chaos, nonsense, or strange events. But for Camus, the absurd comes from the meeting of two realities. On one side is the human desire for meaning, justice, order, and final answers. On the other side is a universe that does not provide those answers. The absurd exists neither in the world alone, nor in human beings alone. It appears in the conflict between our need to understand and the silence of reality. That silence can be deeply unsettling. From an early age, we learn to look for explanations for everything. We want to know why we suffer, why good people experience tragedy, why death exists, and what the purpose of our lives is. When those answers never come, we feel an emptiness that no simple explanation can fill. According to Camus, there are three possible responses to that emptiness. The first is to deny the absurd by convincing ourselves that there is a final answer, even without enough evidence. The second is to give up on life itself, believing that without meaning, everything is pointless. Camus rejects both options. The third possibility, which he sees as both the hardest and the most human, is to accept the absurd and continue living passionately in spite of it. This is where the figure of Sisyphus comes in. In Greek mythology, Sisyphus was condemned by the gods to push a huge rock up a mountain forever. Every time he neared the top, the rock rolled back down, forcing him to begin again for all eternity. At first glance, it seems like the perfect image of a meaningless existence. But Camus offers a completely unexpected interpretation of the myth. For him, the most important moment is not when Sisyphus is pushing the rock, but when he walks back down the mountain to retrieve it once again. At that moment, he is fully aware of his condition. There is no hope of escape and no promise of future reward. Yet he keeps walking. Camus ends the essay with one of the most famous lines in modern philosophy. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. That statement often surprises people. How could someone trapped in an endless, hopeless task possibly be happy? Camus answers that true freedom begins when we stop expecting the universe to hand us a ready-made meaning for our lives. By fully accepting his condition, Sisyphus is no longer defeated by it. The rock is still heavy, but it no longer controls his mind. The same idea appears in The Stranger, perhaps Camus' best-known novel. The main character, Meursault, lives in a way that is very different from what society expects. He does not pretend to feel emotions he does not have. He does not search for grand explanations for his actions, and he faces death without comforting illusions. Many readers see him as cold or uncaring, But Camus uses him to show the conflict between someone who accepts reality as it is and a society that demands moral and religious explanations for everything. As the novel unfolds, it becomes clear that Meursault is judged not only because of the crime he committed, but also because he refuses to play the role society expects of him. His honesty about his own existence becomes almost more shocking than his actions. Camus suggests that people often prefer comforting stories over the difficult acceptance of reality. Another important part of his philosophy appears in The Plague. In this novel, an epidemic strikes an entire city, forcing everyone to face the fragility of life. Instead of presenting suffering as divine punishment or as a path to future reward, Camus shows ordinary people trying to care for one another in the middle of disaster. Dr. Bernard Rieu, the story's main character, continues treating the sick even though he knows he may never completely defeat the disease. This attitude reveals an essential part of Camus' ethics. If the universe offers no guarantee of justice, that does not mean we should give up on compassion. Quite the opposite. Because life is fragile, our choices become even more important. The absence of a higher purpose does not remove human responsibility. It makes it even more urgent. Camus also rejects what he calls philosophical suicide. This expression does not refer to physical suicide. Instead, it describes the attempt to escape the absurd by accepting explanations that artificially solve the problem. Whenever someone claims to have a final answer to every mystery of existence without honestly facing the difficulties involved, Camus believes they have abandoned the true spirit of philosophy. Still, it would be a mistake to think that Camus promotes a pessimistic view of life. His philosophy is far from hopeless. In fact, it invites us to live more intensely. If there is no guaranteed eternity waiting for us, then every friendship, every act of kindness, every moment of beauty, and every human experience becomes infinitely valuable precisely because it is temporary. This appreciation for the present runs through all of his work. Instead of living while waiting for a future reward, or constantly regretting what cannot be changed, Camus encourages a life of lucidity. Lucidity means looking at reality without illusions, recognizing both its beauty and its harshness. It is a demanding way of living because it removes many of the psychological comforts we naturally seek. His influence on existentialism was enormous, even though he personally rejected that label. Camus preferred to be seen as a philosopher of the absurd and of rebellion. In his philosophy, rebellion does not mean violence or destruction. It means choosing to continue affirming human dignity, even when the universe remains indifferent to our hopes and expectations. His message remains deeply relevant today. In a world shaped by crises, unexpected losses, and constant uncertainty, many people still search for answers that will completely remove suffering. Camus suggests that this goal may be impossible, but that does not mean life loses its value. On the contrary, the greatness of life may lie in having the courage to create meaning through our own choices, without depending on the promise of a final explanation. In the end, Albert Camus does not ask us to replace hope with despair. He offers something even more challenging, to learn how to live with clarity in a silent universe, discovering that true dignity comes not from the answers we receive, but from the way we continue moving forward after realizing that some of life's biggest questions may never be fully answered. Imagine waking up in a universe where no higher power has decided who you should be, what your life's purpose is, or what choices you need to make. There is no predetermined destiny, no assigned mission, and no invisible plan guiding every step. For some people, that idea feels liberating. For others, it is deeply frightening. Jean-Paul Sartre believed that this is exactly the human condition. If God does not exist, he argued, then there is no fixed human nature waiting to be discovered. We become who we are through the choices we make. This idea is at the heart of two of his most important works. Existentialism is a humanism and being and nothingness. Sartre begins with one of the most famous statements in modern philosophy. Existence precedes essence. Although this sounds complicated, the idea is surprisingly simple. An object, like a chair, is created with a specific purpose in mind. First, there is a design, and then the object is built to fulfill that purpose. Human beings, according to Sartre, are different. We are not born with a predetermined essence. We exist first, and then through our choices, we shape who we become. This shift in perspective has enormous consequences. For centuries, many religious traditions understood human beings as part of a plan established by God. Our nature, our duties, and our purpose were believed to be built into creation itself. Sartre asks, what if there is no creator? In that case, there is no hidden instruction manual telling us who we are supposed to be. Every person becomes responsible for creating their own identity. But that responsibility is far from comfortable. Contrary to what many people think, Sartre does not describe freedom as something easy or enjoyable. Instead, he says that we are condemned to be free. He chose the word condemned very carefully. We did not choose to be born. We did not choose the time in history we live in, our family, or many of the circumstances surrounding us. But once we are thrown into the world, we cannot escape the need to choose how we respond to those circumstances. Even when someone says they do not want to make a decision, they have already made one. Choosing to do nothing is still a choice. Blindly following other people's expectations is also a choice. According to Sartre, there is never a moment when we can completely escape responsibility. Freedom is present in every moment of our lives. This realization is what gives rise to what Sartre calls anguish. Unlike fear, which has a specific object, anguish comes from recognizing the weight of our own freedom. We do not feel anguish only because we might fail. We feel it because we understand that no one else can live our lives for us. Every decision closes off countless other possibilities and helps shape the person we become. This idea is especially clear in existentialism, is a humanism. Sartre argues that when we choose our actions, we are also presenting an image of what we believe a human being should be. Our choices are never just about ourselves. They express values that we believe are worth living by. That is why individual responsibility is much greater than we often realize. At the same time, freedom often creates a powerful desire to escape. Sartre identifies a behavior he calls bad faith. Bad faith happens when we try to convince ourselves that we are not really free. Instead of accepting responsibility for our choices, we hide behind excuses such as fate, personality, upbringing, or external circumstances. One of Sartre's most famous examples is that of a waiter who performs his job in an overly theatrical way. He behaves as if he is nothing more than a waiter, reducing his entire identity to the role he plays at work. For Sartre, this behavior reveals an unconscious attempt to escape freedom. After all, it is easier to believe that we are only what we do than to admit that we always have the ability to choose differently. This criticism remains incredibly relevant today. How often do people say, "That's just the way I am," as if their personality were a permanent prison? How many people blame society, their family, or their past for every decision they make in the present? Sartre recognizes that our circumstances have a deep influence on our lives, but he insists that they never completely take away our ability to choose how we respond. This does not mean ignoring the real limits of life. No one chooses the conditions they are born into. There are inequalities, injustices, illnesses, and countless situations beyond our control. Sartre calls these conditions facticity. Human freedom never exists in a vacuum. It always operates within a concrete reality. Even so, no matter what limitations we face, we still have the ability to decide how we will deal with them. This way of thinking also changes how Sartre understands morality. If God does not exist and there are no eternal moral laws written into the universe, We cannot simply look up an absolute rulebook before acting. That does not mean anything goes. It means that every individual must take full responsibility for the consequences of their choices. The absence of a divine lawgiver does not eliminate ethics. It makes ethics even more demanding. That responsibility can feel overwhelming. Many people wish someone would simply tell them the right path in every situation. But Sartre believes that this search for ready-made answers is often an attempt to escape our own freedom. No philosophy, religion, or tradition can completely replace the personal decision that every human life requires. In Being and Nothingness, Sartre takes this idea even further by examining the relationship between consciousness and the world. For him, consciousness is never something fixed or complete. It is always reaching toward future possibilities, constantly going beyond what it already is. Human beings live between who they have been and who they still have the potential to become. This ongoing openness explains why we are never fully defined. Another important theme in his philosophy is our relationship with other people. Sartre points out that our freedom does not exist in isolation. We live among other people who also make choices, form opinions, and influence the way we see ourselves. His famous line, "Hell is other people," from the play No Exit, is often misunderstood. Sartre did not mean that other people are always a source of suffering. His point was that the gaze of others has the power to shape how we understand our own identity. This tension between individual freedom and living with others remains one of the greatest challenges of human existence. We want to be authentic, but we also seek acceptance. We want independence, yet we inevitably live in relationship with other people. Sartre does not offer an easy solution to this conflict. He simply shows that it is part of what it means to be human. His influence reached far beyond philosophy, shaping literature, psychology, politics, and the arts. Even those who disagree with his conclusions recognize the power of his central challenge. If there truly is no prewritten destiny, then every choice we make helps create who we become. Identity is no longer something we inherit. It becomes a work that is constantly being created. Perhaps that is the most unsettling part of Sartre's philosophy. Many people think freedom means living without limits or responsibilities. Sartre argues the exact opposite. The greater our freedom, the greater the weight of the consequences we must carry. And perhaps the hardest challenge is not discovering whether God exists, but accepting that, whatever the answer may be, no one else can choose the life we are meant to live except ourselves. There are certain human experiences that seem to resist any purely material explanation. The feeling that no achievement is ever enough, the constant search for a happiness that never seems to last, and the strange sense that we were made for something greater, have followed people across different cultures and throughout history. Many try to fill that emptiness with success, money, relationships, or recognition. Others see it as nothing more than a feature of human psychology. C.S. Lewis offered a different interpretation. He believed that this deep desire, which never seems to be fully satisfied, might not be a flaw in our minds, but a sign that we were created for a reality beyond this world. Before becoming one of the best-known defenders of Christianity in the 20th century, Lewis went through a long intellectual journey. For many years, he identified as an atheist and believed the universe could be explained without God. However, his background in literature, philosophy, and history led him to question some of his own beliefs. That personal transformation deeply shaped books like Mere Christianity and The Problem of Pain, where he argues that the Christian faith is not just a religious tradition, but also a rational response to life's deepest questions. One of Lewis's best-known ideas begins with a very simple observation. Every natural desire corresponds in some way to something that can satisfy it. We feel hungry because food exists. We feel thirsty because water exists. We get tired because we need rest. Then he asks a fascinating question. What about our desire for perfect happiness? for a kind of fulfillment that nothing in this world can completely provide? Where does that desire come from? Lewis argues that this universal longing may be evidence that we were made for something beyond the material world. In Mere Christianity, he writes that if we find within ourselves a desire that no earthly experience can fully satisfy, a most likely explanation is that we were made for another world. This is not a mathematical proof that God exists, but a philosophical argument based on human experience itself. Lewis gave this deep longing a special name, joy. It is important not to confuse this with pleasure or temporary happiness. The joy Lewis describes is a kind of longing for something we have never fully experienced. It may appear while looking at a beautiful landscape, listening to music, reading a great poem, or enjoying a moment of extraordinary beauty. These experiences awaken something powerful inside us, but the feeling quickly fades. What remains is the realization that none of those experiences fully satisfied what we were truly searching for. According to Lewis, many people make the mistake of thinking those moments are the goal of life itself. In reality, he believed they are signs pointing toward something greater. It is like mistaking a road sign for the destination. The beauty of the world awakens a desire that the world itself cannot completely satisfy. This idea connects with another important part of his philosophy, the existence of a universal moral law. In Mere Christianity, Lewis points out that people from very different cultures often share basic ideas about justice, honesty, courage, and compassion. Although customs and traditions vary, there is still a common sense that some actions are morally better than others. Lewis argued that this experience cannot be explained only by biological evolution or social conventions. After all, we often know what is right and still choose to do the opposite. There is a voice inside us that not only describes our behavior, but also judges it. Lewis believed this moral conscience points to a higher reality, an objective source of goodness that goes beyond personal preferences. Of course, many philosophers have criticized this view. Some argue that morality can be understood as the result of human social evolution. Lewis was familiar with these objections, but he insisted that they do not completely solve the problem. Explaining how certain behaviors developed does not necessarily explain why we continue to believe that some actions are truly right while others are deeply wrong. Another important contribution from Lewis appears in the problem of pain, where he addresses one of the greatest challenges to the Christian faith. If God is perfectly good and all-powerful, why does so much suffering exist? Instead of avoiding this question, Lewis places it at the center of his discussion. He acknowledges that suffering is a serious challenge for any religious worldview, and rejects simplistic answers that try to explain every tragedy away. According to Lewis, part of human suffering is connected to free will. A world where people are truly free is also a world where they can choose selfishness, violence, and injustice. Completely removing that possibility would also remove genuine freedom. Love can only be real if it is freely chosen, and every freedom involves risk. But Lewis goes even further. He argues that suffering also has a unique ability to wake us up to questions we might otherwise ignore. One of the most famous lines from The Problem of Pain summarizes this idea. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. According to Lewis, pain has the unusual power to break through our illusions of self-sufficiency and force us to face what truly matters. This does not mean suffering is good in itself or something we should seek. Lewis never romanticizes pain. His point is different. Even the hardest experiences can become opportunities for deep personal transformation. His philosophy also places great value on the imagination. As a literature professor and the author of the Chronicles of Narnia, Lewis believed that stories have a unique ability to reveal profound truths about human nature. Imagination is not the enemy of reason. On the contrary, it prepares the mind to understand aspects of reality that cannot always be expressed through logic alone. This combination of reason, imagination, and personal experience made Lewis's philosophy especially accessible. He did not write only for scholars. His books connect with everyday readers because they begin with experiences everyone understands: the search for happiness, the reality of suffering, the pursuit of truth, and the longing for justice. His influence remains enormous in philosophy, literature, and Christian apologetics. Even those who disagree with his conclusions often recognize the depth of the questions he raises. After all, almost everyone has experienced that strange feeling that life's greatest joys seem to point towards something that always remains just beyond our reach. Perhaps that is where the true strength of Lewis's thought lies. Instead of beginning with doctrines or religious beliefs, he invites readers to carefully examine their own inner experience. Why do we keep searching for a happiness that no achievement can preserve? Why does beauty awaken a longing that is so difficult to explain? Why do we carry within us a desire that seems greater than anything this world can offer? For C.S. Lewis, these questions are not signs of a flaw in human nature. They are echoes of a greater reality, suggesting that the human heart may have always carried the quiet memory of a destiny it was created for, long before it ever learned how to give that longing a name. Few philosophers have looked at existence with as much radical honesty as Emil Cioran. While many thinkers tried to defend faith, reject it, or reconcile it with reason, Cioran chose to remain in the territory of permanent doubt. He offered no philosophical systems and no comforting answers. His writing is made up of fragments, aphorisms, and reflections that feel as though they come from someone willing to face the most painful questions of the human condition without relying on easy comfort. Among all those questions, perhaps the most unsettling is this: is faith a discovery of truth, or is it the last illusion humanity created to endure its own existence? This question runs through books like A Short History of Decay and the Trouble with Being Born. Unlike philosophers who try to build careful arguments either proving or disproving God, Cioran begins with inner experience. His interest is not simply whether God exists, but why human beings feel such a deep need to believe in something greater than their own fragile lives. For Cioran, there is a contradiction that cannot be ignored. We are fully aware of our own mortality. We know that one day we will die. We witness the suffering of innocent people. We live with loss, illness, and failure every day. And yet, we continue to long for meaning, permanence, and hope. This tension creates a discomfort that follows us throughout life. Perhaps, Cioran suggests, religion is born from that very discomfort. In A Short History of Decay, Cioran describes lucidity as a deeply unsettling experience. The more we realize that there are no final answers, the harder it becomes to build our lives on absolute certainty. Many people prefer to surround themselves with unquestionable beliefs because those beliefs provide emotional stability. Doubt, on the other hand, demands quiet courage. It forces us to move forward without guarantees, living with questions that may never have final answers. At the same time, it would be a mistake to think that Cioran simply mocked faith. His relationship with God is far more complicated. Throughout his writings, there is a kind of melancholy fascination with religion. He often writes about saints, mystics, and spiritual experiences with deep admiration, even while admitting that he cannot fully share their certainty. This inner conflict gives his philosophy much of its depth. Cioran does not despise faith. He suffers because he cannot truly live within it. This tension appears again and again in his aphorisms. At times, he suggests that human beings may need God even when they are unable to believe. The psychological need for something beyond ourselves remains alive regardless of what reason concludes. There is something inside us that resists the idea of a completely indifferent universe. We want to believe that our suffering has meaning, that death is not the final word, and that existence does not simply disappear into silence. But Cioran refuses to accept any answer simply because it offers comfort. For him, embracing a belief only because it eases our pain is a serious intellectual risk. If truth exists, it does not have to match what we want to hear. That radical honesty makes his philosophy one of the most unsettling of the 20th century. In The Trouble with Being Born, this radical honesty reaches perhaps its highest point. The title itself reveals the tone of the book. Choran reflects on birth not as an obvious gift, but as the event that throws us into a world marked by pain, aging, and death. Its pages are filled with observations that challenge every form of naive optimism. Even so, reducing his philosophy to simple pessimism would be unfair. In reality, Choran uses pessimism as an extreme form of philosophical honesty. He believed that overly optimistic views of life often ignore essential parts of the human experience. Instead of hiding suffering behind motivational speeches or comforting metaphysical promises, he preferred to face it directly. Paradoxically, this approach creates an unexpected effect. By letting go of easy illusions, his writing invites readers into a more authentic relationship with life itself. Another defining feature of his philosophy is his distrust of certainty. Choran was deeply suspicious of any system that claimed to have final answers to every question about existence. Political ideologies, religious doctrines, and all-encompassing philosophies often seemed to him like human attempts to eliminate the anxiety created by uncertainty. In his view, the stronger someone's absolute certainty, the greater the risk of intolerance. This outlook also explains his fragmented writing style. Instead of producing organized philosophical treatises, Choran chose short aphorisms, many of which even contradict one another. This was not a lack of discipline, but a deliberate choice. Human reality is simply too complex to fit into final formulas. Our thinking changes with experience, time, and circumstances. Accepting that instability is part of the intellectual honesty he valued so highly. Despite all his skepticism, Choran could never completely leave behind religious language. God appears constantly throughout his work, not as a certainty, but as a painful absence. It is almost as if the inability to believe fully was just as powerful for him as the desire to believe. This paradox gives rise to some of the most moving pages in his philosophy. At many points, it becomes clear that Choran secretly envies those who are able to believe, not because he considers faith irrational, but because he sees in it a peace that always seems beyond his reach. That quiet envy reveals something deeply human. Many people live with exactly the same struggle. They long for spiritual certainty, but cannot ignore the doubts that grow through honest reflection. His influence extends far beyond philosophy. Writers, psychologists, artists, and intellectuals have been drawn to his remarkable ability to turn despair into literature of extraordinary quality. Choran shows that deep thinking does not always lead to comfort. Sometimes it leads to the realization that certain questions will remain unanswered. Even so, there is a quiet kind of hope in his work. Not hope based on future promises or absolute answers, but hope found in the courage to keep thinking. For Choran, remaining clear-minded in the face of mystery is itself an act of dignity. Human beings may never completely solve the puzzle of existence, but they can refuse both blind despair and easy illusions. His reflections provide a powerful conclusion to the philosophical journey we have followed. Throughout history, we have seen thinkers who tried to prove God through reason, others who defended faith as a leap beyond logic, some who rejected every form of transcendence, and others who tried to rebuild morality without God. Choran looks at all of these attempts with a quiet and deeply restless mind. Instead of choosing one final position, he remains before the mystery itself, recognizing both humanity's need to believe and the difficulty of turning that desire into certainty. Perhaps that is exactly why his philosophy continues to fascinate so many people. It offers no safe shelter from doubt, yet it does not turn doubt into hopeless despair. At the end of this journey, One question still remains a question that has echoed through centuries of philosophical thought and may never stop following humanity. When every answer seems incomplete, is faith still the last bridge between human beings and the infinite? Or is it simply the most beautiful dream we have created to bear the weight of our own existence? We've reached the end of this deep journey through some of the greatest philosophical debates about God, faith, reason, and existence. Each thinker we explored offered a different perspective on one of humanity's oldest questions. What is the true meaning of our existence? Thank you for watching this video all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this discussion, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with others who enjoy philosophy and big ideas. And let us know in the comments which philosopher stood out to you the most. Your opinion might inspire a whole new discussion for everyone who follows the channel. Stay with us for more videos exploring philosophy, history, and the great ideas that have shaped humanity.